In this video, we will learn how to set up a build deploy pipeline in GitHub Actions using AWS CDK. We will see how to deploy a web API application that talks to DynamoDB and SNS. We'll also deploy a Lambda function that has an SNS trigger which will process the messages coming into the SNS. I'll walk you through setting up the GitHub Actions workflow to automatically create these resources and also deploy our application code to these resources. Hello everyone, my name is Rahul and welcome back to this YouTube channel. If you're new here, I make videos on .NET, Cloud and DevOps. This video is sponsored by AWS and is part of my AWS CDK series. Here I have my existing application opened in Visual Studio Code. Now to all the GitHub Actions workflow, I prefer using VS Code rather than using JetBrains Rider or Visual Studio. Now in the existing solution, under the source folder, we have the projects. So we have the API project, the messages, which is a shared library that shares messages across both the services and the API, and also the services project, which has the Lambda function that is triggered by the message in SNS. Now all this code is in .NET, so my build deploy pipeline will also be using .NET command tools. Now we also have the weather forecast.cdk project, which has the CDK code to set up our infrastructure. Now, if you're completely new to CDK, I highly recommend checking out my Getting Started video on CDK, which will get you up to speed. I also built this project and the CDK code while demonstrating how we can deploy this to local stack. Now, local stack simulates the AWS resources on your local dev machine, making it very easy to test your applications locally from your computer itself. Now, we can use CDK to create and deploy resources to local stack as well, which I covered in another video. All the links will be there in the descriptions below. So let's get started to deploy these applications into AWS using GitHub Actions. So here under my GitHub account, I have a repository AWS CDK GitHub Actions. Now this has the source code of the project that we were currently looking. Now to add a GitHub workflow, we need to add it under a specific directory. So let's first go ahead and create that. So this needs to be in a new directory. So let's create a new directory and call this as .github and also specify /workflows, which is the directory the GitHub Actions file should be in. So let's put that in there and let's create a new file inside that. We will call this as weather data service.yml, which is the extension for GitHub Actions workflow. Now in Visual Studio, you can install extensions that will give you ability to work with GitHub Actions. So you can use the Ctrl+Shift+P or navigate to your extensions bar over here and search for the extension. Now the extension that I'm using is the GitHub Actions extension from GitHub itself. Now this provides various features that will help you and assist you in generating this workflow files. So make sure you have this installed. So let's navigate back into our YML file and let's start creating this GitHub Actions. Now you can also do the same from GitHub itself. So if you navigate into github.com and navigate under Actions tab, you can create a new Actions workflow file from here. So you can pick and choose from some of the starter templates in here and use this or create a workflow all by yourself. So if you click that, you can create a new file and start authoring the workflow file right in the github.com website itself. But I'd prefer to use the Visual Studio IDE because that's much more flexible. So let's first specify a name for this. So we'll call this as weather data service. Let's specify what is going to trigger this workflow file. So we can use the on keyword for that. The GitHub Actions plugin does provide IntelliSense that we can use to assist us in creating this workflow file. So if you type Ctrl+Shift+P and choose and change the language mode, you can search for GitHub Actions workflow, which is what it needs to be set up to be able to get the IntelliSense. Now, once we have given the on, we can see we can give it as push, which is on the push to a new branch or pull request, etc. So let's specify push in this case, and let's specify push to specific branches. So in this case, I will use the branch main, which is my main branch. So you can adjust this as it's required for your development team and the process that you follow with the build and deploy. So right now, anytime a push is going to happen on the main branch, this workflow file is going to be triggered. Once specifying that, let's specify the jobs, which is going to be build and deploy in this case. You can ideally separate these out, but for now, I'm just keeping this together, building and deploying in a single job. Now, we can specify the runs on, which is the machine that this will run on. Now, since this is .NET Core, we can run on Ubuntu latest. So let's use the latest image of Ubuntu. Let's also specify the permissions for this particular job. So let's specify the permissions tab. Now we need to be able to read the contents of the repository. So let's specify contents read. Now we can define the different steps that's required inside our build and deploy job. So let's use steps keyword and let's start defining the different steps. So we'll need to first check out our source code. Then we'll need to set up that .NET environment exists. And also we'll need to install the CDK tools and the .NET packaging tools for Lambda function. So let's do all these steps first. So let's first do the checkout. So let's call this with the name checkout repo. And let's specify the users tab, which is going to be the action that this is going to use. So let's specify users. And in this case, we can specify actions/checkout _ the version. We can also specify the main branch or the master branch where the latest source code is going to be there. So I'm going to specify version 4. In this case, that is the latest version. So if you control and click this specific actions, it will take you to the GitHub Actions page in github.com. So you can scroll down and see the documentation of this specific action. So you can see the version 4 is the latest. So this is going to check out the repository for us. Now let's also specify the next step, which is going to be installing .NET. So let's specify setup.NET and let's specify the action that we're going to use for that. So in this case, we're going to specify actions and use the setup-.NET. Now this again needs the version. So let's specify version 4. And if you want more details, you can navigate to that specific one and you can read the documentation in here. Now with this, we need to specify the .NET version that we need to use. So now since we are using .NET 8 and we can specify the width, specify the .NET version. So let's use .NET version and let's specify version 8. Now to build the Lambda function, we can use the .NET Lambda tools package. So let's install that. So let's specify the name and let's specify install AWS Lambda tools. Now in this case, this is simply going to be a run command because we already have .NET set up. So let's use the .NET tool, install and install it globally inside this specific Ubuntu machine that's going to be pulled down for our build. So let's specify amazon.lambda.tools, which is going to install the Lambda tools. We also need to set up node because we'll need to run the CDK command line. So let's specify setup node.js and let's specify the users. And in this case, actions setup-node _ v4. Now this again needs the version that you need to use. So let's specify the node version and let's specify 20 in this case. Now once we have the node installed, let's install AWS CDK. So let's use that and let's use the run command and say npm install -g AWS-CDK. Now that we have all the required tools and environment set up for our build, let's start building our project. So let's build our API project first. So let's specify the name and let's specify package API. Now this is going to package the API project that we have. So in this case, we're going to again use the run command and use the .NET CLI to build and package our application. Since this is going to be the multiple lines, I'm going to start with the pipe simple and put the command below this. Now, if you navigate into our project, I had already created a build.ps1 in the previous video on local stack and CDK to set up this build command. Now, we can reuse the exact same command to package our API into a Lambda package. So we will be hosting our API on a Lambda function in this scenario. So let's copy this and put this inside our new YML file. So in this multiple line, we can paste this in here. Let's also make sure that the indentation is correct. So let's make sure that's right. So here, this is going to use .NET Lambda package, the project location, which is in the root source folder and API, and it's specifying the configuration, the framework, and the output package where it needs to be placed. For the first step, let's just deploy the API and see how that is getting set up. So we'll ignore the Lambda function that's getting triggered by SNS. So let's now deploy this package to CDK so then we can come back later and add in the Lambda function. So for that, we'll first need to set up the AWS CDK with the appropriate credentials so that it can talk to my AWS account. So in this case, let's specify configure AWS credentials. So this again uses the AWS-actions, and let's specify configure-AWS credentials. Now this again has the version 4, so let's specify that. For more details on this specific action, you can again control-click this and it will take you to the GitHub page of that specific action. So you can see the documentation for that as well. Now for this specific action, we need to specify the credentials that will be used to establish the connection. So let's specify the with property, and let's also specify the different access keys parameters. So we'll need to specify the access key ID. We'll get the access keys from GitHub secrets. So let's use variables to refer GitHub secrets. So to do that, we can specify the dollar, and let's specify the secrets dot and the secret key that we will be using. So in this case, let's specify this as AWS access key ID. So now we'll need to specify this specific secret under our repository. Now right now this says it's invalid because we don't have a secret set up. Now, the GitHub Actions plugin allows you to do that from within the IDE. So if I navigate into the GitHub Actions plugin, you can see the different details of this specific GitHub repository. You'll need to first establish the connection with your GitHub account to make this available. So now under secrets and repository secrets, you can create a repository secret. So let's create a new repository secret for this AWS access key ID. So let's do that from within the IDE. So let's click the plus. We first need to specify the name. So let's enter the name for this. We need to add a secret value. So we'll need an access key ID. Now in this case, I have set up a new user under my IAM. So if I navigate into my AWS, I can navigate to IAM, and I have created a new user for GitHub Actions. So this will be having the specific permissions that's required to deploy and manage the resources. So you can see the GitHub Actions for which I have got the access key ID and an access key secret. So I will be using that to set up the GitHub Actions CDK pipeline. So let's navigate back and let's use that access value inside this. So let me copy and paste that specific access key. And that's going to create this specific secret into my GitHub account. So if I navigate back into my GitHub repository and navigate to settings and go to secrets and variables, and under actions, we can see this new access key ID getting created. Now you can also create a new access key right from here. So we'll also need an AWS access secret. So let's specify AWS _ secret access key. Now, this is going to be the access key that is for that specific account. So let's specify that, and let me copy and paste that specific access key secret. And let's say add secret. Now this is going to add the secret again to this account, which is going to show up inside our IDE for that specific repository. So you can see the secret access key is also now added. Now let's specify that as well. So let's specify AWS secret access key. And this again is going to come from secret. So let's specify secrets.aws secret access key. Now this is all providing intelligence for me, which makes it easy to author this template. Now we also need to specify the region. So you can see there is an error in the with. So this is going to show that the required parameters is missing, which is the AWS region. So let's specify the AWS-region that this is going to get deployed to. Now in this case, I'm going to specify AP Southeast 2. Which is going to be the region that I'm using. So you can choose whichever region you want to deploy the resources into. Now, since we are only deploying one of these projects, let's make sure to go into our CDK project and comment out the other Lambda function. So if I navigate to weather forecast tag, you can see the weather data processor is this weather Lambda function. So let's comment this out so that this resource is not getting created. So let's comment this line. Let's also comment this 2 lines which grants its permission to the SQS and the SNS. We'll come back again and add this into the pipeline to see how the updating resources and updating pipeline flow works. So let's come back to our YML file. Now that we have the AWS console configured, let's use the CDK deploy command. So let's write that step. So let's specify name and let's specify CDK deploy. Now in this case, I'm assuming that the account is already bootstrapped, which means we just need to run the CDK deploy. So let's use the run command and let's specify CDK deploy. Now we can also specify --all, which says all the stack, and also let's disable the require approval. So in this case, let's specify require approval and pass it never, so that it doesn't need any approval, because you don't want to be approving these things inside your GitHub Actions pipeline. So let's make sure to save that. With all that set up, let's commit this and deploy to our GitHub main branch. So let's commit this file. So let's go into our GitHub source control. Let's add this specific two files that we updated. We've commented out the Lambda function and also this new workflow file. So let's stage these changes and let's specify adding GitHub Actions work. And let's commit this. So you can use Ctrl+Shift+V and also use git push to push these changes to your repository. So as soon as the push is going to come into our GitHub repository, it's going to show up under our Actions tab. So if I navigate into Actions tab, you can see this workflow being triggered. Now in this case, there is an error in the build and deploy. So let's navigate into that and we can see which step has been errored. So you can see the package API has an error because it says the -- configuration command is not found. Now this is very likely because of an indentation issue. So if I navigate back in here, you can see I have used a wrong separator to delimit this specific command because I copy and pasted this from the PowerShell command. So in this case, we need to use / to delimit. So let's specify / and also / in all these 3 lines. Now, once we fix that, let's commit this again. So let's navigate into this and let's say fixing command delimiter. And let's commit this and deploy this again. So let's say git push, which is going to push this into the repository and it's going to again trigger that specific workflow. Now, since I am pushing this directly to my main branch, which is why it's triggering the workflow automatically because we have specified on push on the branch main. So if I navigate back and refresh this actions page, you can see a new build being triggered. And this time it's saying the project location is not a directory. This is because I've used the wrong slashes inside my directory path. So we'll need to specify /, which is the way that we'll need to specify for the Ubuntu machine. We can also remove the last trailing / inside this and let's deploy this again. So let's say stage changes and let's say fixing directory path. Now, making multiple changes to get your first workflow step ready is a very common thing. It's very hard to get this right in the first time. If you want to learn how to set up the GitHub Actions workflow on my local machine and test it locally so that you don't have to push and see this in GitHub Actions, let me know in the comments below and I'll do a video on that. But for now, let's get this workflow file to work. So let's navigate back and let's refresh this inside here. So let's go to the Actions tab and it's again failed on that specific path. So let's navigate into this and this time it has failed on CDK deploy step. So you can say you can either specify the stacks or the -- all argument, which means the build is successfully completing. Now the only issue is with the CDK deploy step. So if I navigate back into that, you can see we have specified the -- all. However, in the - require approval, I only specified one --. So let's fix that and let's push this again. I'm hoping this is the final time and we will get this right. So let's say fixing CDK deploy and let's commit this. And let's again git push and this will trigger the workflow and we can see the results soon. Now this has again triggered this. You can watch each of these steps as it progresses. So you can see it's right now checking out the repository, setting up the .NET, installing Lambda tools. It set up the node, installing the AWS CDK and it's packaging our API, which had succeeded in the previous step. So I'm assuming it will in this step as well. And now it's finally hitting the CDK deploy, which is going to deploy our resources. So now this time we fixed the command. I hope this succeeds. Now it's going into the synthesis of the CDK template, which means it looks like it has succeeded. Now, if there's any issues inside the CDK template, that's also going to throw an error. So let's wait for this to complete. So if I navigate into the AWS account under AWS and CloudFormation, we should be able to see the stack deploying. So you can see the weather forecast stack, the create is in progress. So if I navigate into that, you can see the resources that's getting created. Now these resources are getting created because of this GitHub Actions getting triggered. Now this is complete, which means our stack creation is also complete. So let's refresh this and you can see the create is complete. So if I navigate back into the output, you can see we would have outputted in the CDK step the URL for our API. So here in this case, we can see the URL. So if I navigate into that, And let's navigate to the Swagger endpoint. So let's navigate into swagger.index.html, which shows the Swagger for our API. So let's post a new data. So let's say try it out. Let's specify Brisbane. Let's specify the temperature as 27 and let's give the string as hot. It is really hot here. So let's click execute, which is going to add this into the DynamoDB and also publish to SNS. So if I navigate into the resource for weather forecast data into the data table, we can see this item inside our database table. So in the Explore database, you can see Brisbane, hot, and 27. Now we have successfully deployed our web API, which talks to DynamoDB and also publishes the message. And here you can see the weather data queue, which is an AWS SQS queue. So let's navigate to this specific SQS queue. So let's navigate into the AWS console. Let's go to AWS SQS. And here you can see that queue, which is weather data. Now, if I send and receive messages from this, you should be able to see the message that we just sent. So if you see poll for messages, it's showing that message. So you can see the temperature is 27 and summary is hot. Now this message is waiting to be processed by our Lambda function. So let's go ahead and update the code to deploy our Lambda function. So let's come back to Visual Studio. Let's go into our weather forecast CDK and let's uncomment these resources so that the Lambda function is going to get created. And let's also come back and add the required steps in our GitHub workflow. Now this particular function requires the service to be in service.zip. So let's make sure to copy and paste this packaging step and create one for a Lambda function that processes from SNS. So let's paste this in here. Let's make sure the indentation is correct in this case. Let's specify the project, which is going to be weather forecast-service, and let's also specify this as service.zip. Now we have specified everything else as correct and we don't have to do anything else because all we are doing is making sure that the package exists and the code changes is in the CDK script. So let's make sure to save this and let's commit this specific changes. So let's add these changes and let's say adding Lambda function for SQS processing. And let's push this again, which is going to trigger the workflow and start building and deploying the new changes. So let's come back to our GitHub repository under Actions, and this has triggered a new build deploy. So this time it's also packaging the service project and appropriately updating that inside this specific artifacts folder. Now it's going through the CDK deploy. So if I go into the CloudFormation and refresh this, you should be able to see the update that's going to happen. So the update is in progress and it's creating the new weather data processor Lambda function. So once that is complete, we should be able to see these messages getting processed. Now the deployment is complete. So if I come back and refresh this, you can see all the deployment is complete. So we also have the weather data processor. So if I navigate into that and go into the logs for that specific Lambda function. So let's go to monitor and let's say view CloudWatch logs. Now we can see the CloudWatch logs for this specific Lambda function, and we should be able to see the processing of that message. So we have a log stream, and inside this, we have the message processed city, Brisbane, and the temperature 27. Now, if I send a new message, since we already have, so let's specify Brisbane 28. And let's specify very hot and click execute. Now this is also going to send to DynamoDB and to the SQS and get picked up by our weather data processor, and it's going to be logged in this specific log here. So if I refresh this and navigate into this log stream, you can see this message was picked up as well. Now, the next time you make any changes to your project, so if you add more resources or make changes to your CDK, it's going to deploy those resources. However, if you're just going to make changes to your application code, it's going to deploy the latest application code into the respective resources. So if I come here and change the service, and let's change one of the lines for the processing. So let's go into the functions.cs and let's remove the updated message from the processed message. Let's make sure to check this in, fixed processor comment. And let's commit and deploy this changes. So this again is going to trigger the Lambda action, and it's going to build and deploy these code changes to our Lambda function. This happens automatically, which means now you have a successful build deploy pipeline using CDK, which is deploying to your AWS account. Now, since this time we didn't have any infrastructure changes, this took much less time than the previous runs. So our code is successfully deployed, which means if I come back to the Swagger UI and let's specify Brisbane and let's specify the temperature to be 29 and let's click execute, come back to our CloudWatch logs, go to the new log stream that will be created because we redeployed the Lambda function. So let's navigate into that and you can see the message soon here. So you can see the message with the updated text, which is remove the updated word, and it's saying processed message for city with the temperature 29. I hope this helped you to set up your CDK pipeline on GitHub Actions and deploy resources to AWS. If you like this video, please make sure to hit the like button. If you want to be notified of future such videos, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. It also helps me to grow this YouTube channel. Thank you and see you soon in the next video.